They say every neighborhood has a story. Mine? It started with roses, wind chimes, and a purple-trimmed porch swing, a home built on legacy and love. But when control disguised as community moved in next door, everything began to change. Harmless letters turned to threats. Traditions were called violations. And before I knew it, the house that held generations of memories was turned to ash. What they didn't know was, beneath the ruins stood someone who didn't just know the law, someone who had written it. And in their quest for power, they awoke something far more dangerous than rebellion. They awakened justice. They say retirement is when you finally breathe. For me, it felt more like holding my breath underwater, waiting to see what would rise when the ripples calmed. After 30 years on the federal bench, I left behind Washington, D.C., in the courtroom, and the black robes that had defined most of my adult life. All for this: a quiet return to Silverwood Heights, the sleepy town where my childhood memories lived, and my grandmother's century-old Victorian still stood. It wasn't just a house. It was a part of me. My mother had grown up in that house, her mother before her. Every creak of the floorboards told a story. Every peeling purple shutter held memories that smelled of lavender and rain. I didn't come back here to reinvent it. I came back to preserve it. The house had been empty for a few years. I'd kept it maintained through a caretaker. But stepping inside again felt like waking a ghost gently from slumber. I dusted off the old porch swing, repainted the kitchen cabinets with the same eggshell blue Grandma had chosen in 1964, and tended the roses she planted decades ago, still blooming defiantly against the trim lines of modernity. At first, I thought the neighbors would be glad someone was living in the old place again. But it didn't take long before the whispers started. Sideways glances, the occasional slow drive-by from unfamiliar cars, and then the envelope. It came tucked into my mailbox like a threat wearing pearls. A letter from the Silverwood Heights Community Beautification Committee, which I would later learn was code for unofficial HOA led by a man with a power complex named Darren Miles. The letter wasn't a suggestion. It was an expectation. A glossy pamphlet outlined their vision for aesthetic harmony. It demanded I repaint the trim of my house in a neighborhood-appropriate shade, remove the non-standard antique wind chimes hanging from my porch, and replace the wild rose garden with approved boxwoods. It ended with an invitation, disguised as an ultimatum, to join their newly established HOA, a $5,000 initiation fee and $350 a month in dues. In exchange, I'd earn the privilege of adhering to their rules, and more importantly, avoiding the discomfort of non-compliance. I reread the letter 3 times before setting it down. My pulse had slowed, my hands calm. Years of cross-examining criminals and politicians had trained me well. I knew what manipulation looked like. But this was petty tyranny with a suburban smile. That evening, I walked over to Darren's house. A sleek modern structure with sharp edges and white shutters. It sat directly across from my Victorian, like a before and after picture in a real estate brochure. He answered the door in khakis and a silverwood polo, his grin too wide, too polished. "Judge Jennings," he said, extending a hand. "Welcome home. I was hoping you'd be receptive to our invitation." "I've read your documents," I said. "And I'm not interested in joining the HOA, nor am I obligated to. My property predates any covenants by over 70 years. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "We believe that community unity adds value, Judge, and that individuality, while charming, can disrupt that." "I value community," I replied. "But forced conformity isn't community. It's control." The air between us shifted. Darren's tone cooled. "Well, let's hope you reconsider. Would be a shame if certain code enforcement issues began cropping up. These old homes, electrical wiring, roofing violations, they can be so fragile." I stepped forward, letting my silence settle into discomfort. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Miles?" "No," he said too quickly. "Of course not. Just neighborly advice. Sometimes the past has to make room for progress. I turned and walked away. He didn't stop me, but I could feel his eyes digging into my back. When I reached my gate, I looked across the street. His porch light clicked on. I spent that night installing cameras, front porch, garden, driveway. My instincts weren't wrong. People like Darren don't stop at polite letters. They escalate. They prod and push until they meet someone who won't back down. And I had spent a lifetime refusing to back down. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was how far Darren and his HOA would go to erase anything that didn't fit into their narrow vision of perfection, or how deep their reach extended. I believed I was ready for a neighborhood feud, but this wasn't just a feud. This was a war, and they picked the wrong woman to start it with. The first real sign that Darren wasn't bluffing came less than a week later. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast. I'd just finished my second cup of coffee when a loud knock echoed from my front porch. I opened the door to find two uniformed men, code enforcement officers from the county, standing stiffly with clipboards. "Ma'am, we received multiple complaints regarding property violations." The taller one glanced behind him at the vintage wind chimes swaying lazily in the breeze. Specifically, unpermitted exterior fixtures, non-conforming paint, and overgrowth. "Overgrowth?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "You mean the rose garden?" He looked down at his clipboard again. "That's what the complaint says." "I see," I said, stepping out onto the porch. "Would you like to come take a look?" The shorter one hesitated. "We have to respond to every complaint, but this doesn't look out of compliance." "Thank you for your time," I replied, extending a printed copy of my property's historic designation status. "Everything you see here is protected by law, including the paint, the chimes, and the roses." They nodded, offered thin smiles, and left. I watched from the porch as they walked across the street. Darren stood in his driveway, arms folded, phone in hand. When the officers gave him a small shrug, I saw the tightness in his jaw. The first attempt had failed, but he wasn't finished. That week, I started finding letters taped to my door. Not official county notices. These were hand-delivered memos, signed only the Silverwood Committee, filled with vague legal-sounding language about neighborhood expectations and the negative aesthetic impact of non-standard properties. One accused me of attracting rodents with my compost bin. Another warned of possible civil consequences if I continued to refuse community participation. Then came the noise complaints. On Friday morning, I had a visit from a local sheriff's deputy. Someone had reported excessive noise coming from my property at 6 a.m., the same time I usually sat in silence with a book and tea. I invited him in, showed him the timestamps from my security system. Silence. Just the wind, the chimes, and birdsong. The deputy shook his head. "You're not the first person I've visited this week. Same pattern. Anonymous calls, always targeting non-HOA homes. You planning on joining?" I gave a wry smile. "Not a chance." "Then expect more of this. Darren's got friends on the zoning board and the city council." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for the warning." The next day, my trash bins disappeared. Then my mail started arriving opened. The following week, a landscaping crew I didn't hire showed up on my front lawn, ready to begin compliance work. They said they were ordered by neighborhood management. When I asked for documentation, they had none. I told them to leave. One of them muttered, "You're making a mistake, lady." I spent that afternoon going through the security footage. Sure enough, Darren had been pacing the sidewalk earlier that morning with a clipboard. He paused in front of my roses, talking into his phone. Then, at exactly 9:00 a.m., the trucks rolled up. It was subtle, deliberate, but above all, it was orchestrated. This wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor making noise. This was a campaign. One meant to wear me down, make my home feel like a liability instead of a sanctuary. But what Darren failed to consider was who he was dealing with. You don't spend your career uncovering corruption, trying cases that put white-collar criminals in prison, without learning how to build your own case in return. I started logging everything: dates, times, photos, audio, correspondence. I created a file thicker than any case brief I'd ever written. I added the names of every person who showed up on my cameras, from the landscapers to the HOA members who stood at the edge of my lawn and took pictures like they were planning a hit job. And then came the most chilling moment yet. I received an unsigned postcard in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Just 5 words handwritten in sharp, erratic cursive. Old houses catch fire easy. I stared at those words for a long time. My pulse throbbed in my ears, but I didn't panic. I scanned the card for fingerprints, wore gloves when I bagged it, stored it in my growing evidence box. That night, I sat in the living room under the glow of a single lamp. The chimes outside sang in the breeze. My grandmother's portrait watched me from above the mantel. And I knew something Darren didn't. The law doesn't move fast, but it moves with purpose. And once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop. I wasn't going to war with the HOA. I was going to expose an empire of coercion. One file, one recording, and one conviction at a time. By early spring, Silverwood looked pristine on the outside. Fresh lawns, power-washed driveways, trimmed hedges. But there was a quiet rot spreading beneath it all. And it wasn't just my house they were after anymore. Darren's HOA had grown emboldened. What started as harassment against one non-compliant property had turned into a full-fledged purge of individuality in the neighborhood. Any house that didn't meet Darren's sterile design ideals became a target. My neighbors were starting to whisper, quiet concerns, hesitant glances. But no one dared to speak publicly. That changed when Mrs. Lillian Price's mailbox was ripped out of the ground. Lillian was 78. She'd lived in Silverwood since it was just a dirt road and a cluster of post-war cottages. Her mailbox was shaped like a miniature red barn. Her late husband had built it for her on their 25th wedding anniversary. One morning, it was gone, replaced with an HOA standard black metal box. No warning, no paperwork, just a short letter in her screen door that read, "Your previous mailbox did not meet neighborhood specifications. Compliance has been enforced." When I visited her, she was sitting on her porch, a cup of cold tea untouched in her lap. Her voice trembled. "I didn't think they'd come for me," she said. "I paid my dues. I never caused trouble." "They didn't come for you, Lillian," I said, kneeling beside her. "They came for your independence." Later that day, a teenager's custom-painted skateboard ramp disappeared from a side yard. A week after that, the Patel family's colorful front garden was stripped overnight. Every last bloom uprooted and replaced with uniform HOA-approved shrubs. It was happening systematically. I started speaking with neighbors in confidence, off the record, behind hedges, in kitchens with drawn blinds. I listened to story after story of quiet threats, coerced signatures, inspection fees, fines for non-existent violations, and in one case, a family forced to sell after ongoing maintenance issues made their mortgage unmanageable. The buyer? A holding company tied to Darren's cousin. I started mapping it all out. Dozens of properties flipped, all after months of targeted harassment. All bought under market value, then flipped at a profit. It was a racket, and no one was stopping them. Why? Because Darren wasn't working alone. One of the HOA board members, Regina Marsh, worked in the local zoning office. Her husband was on the planning commission. Another board member, Ted Winston, had a quiet stake in a property development firm that specialized in suburban revitalization. They were gaming the system from every angle, inventing infractions, forcing people out, then swooping in to save the neighborhood, one profitable purchase at a time. The HOA wasn't a community organization. It was a machine. But something else disturbed me even more. I started noticing utility workers around my property. Far too often. Gas meters, Checked 3 times in 1 week. A city water rep testing pressure in the hydrant near my house. A man claiming to be an independent energy contractor, inspecting my solar panel hookups without notice. I documented everything. License plates, faces. Every encounter went into the archive. One night, well after midnight, I heard movement by my garage. My motion lights flicked on, and I peeked through the blinds. A man in dark clothing was kneeling by the electrical box. I grabbed my phone, started filming, and hit the intercom. My voice boomed from the outdoor speakers. "You're being recorded. Leave now or police will be called." He froze, then bolted into the dark. I filed the footage with the sheriff. They took the report, but nothing came of it. The deputy looked nervous, almost apologetic. That's when I realized the rot had reached further than just the HOA. Darren's influence touched city council meetings, permitting offices, law enforcement liaisons. He wasn't just trying to force me out. He was betting I wouldn't have anyone to call for help when things turned dangerous. But he still didn't know who I was, or how deep I could go. That weekend I called in a favor. An old friend from my federal clerkship days now worked with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I gave her a full briefing: names, documents, patterns, recordings. "This isn't just harassment," she said, stunned. "This could fall under RICO. If they're flipping properties in a coordinated operation." "Exactly," I said, "and I've got more coming." Within a week, a quiet investigation had begun. Not arrests yet, but data gathering, pattern analysis, the groundwork. In the meantime, I continued my own campaign, low-key but persistent. Quiet conversations, whisper networks. Slowly, the silence in the neighborhood began to crack. Mrs. Price invited me for tea. The Patels started waving again. I saw a new mailbox go up, hand-carved, not HOA approved. A signal. And then a note appeared in my own mailbox. "We know what you're doing." But this time, it wasn't anonymous. It was signed, "The Board." That was the moment I knew. They were preparing for something big, and I had to be ready for the moment they stepped over the line, one they couldn't ever come back from. A week after the warning note appeared in my mailbox, the pressure in Silverwood reached a boiling point. The air had changed. Heavier, suspicious. Neighbors now avoided eye contact again, some returning to Karen's ranks. Darren and the board had begun holding nightly community safety meetings, pushing new emergency ordinances that gave them broader authority to inspect properties, levy fines, and initiate beautification projects without homeowner consent. And they were targeting me. It began with the water. One morning, I turned on my kitchen tap and nothing came out. I checked the main. It was intact. I called the city. They claimed there had been a request from the HOA for a temporary disconnection due to suspected meter tampering. Tampering. I had the paperwork from the city inspection 3 weeks prior. Clean. That same night, floodlights blazed into my backyard. The HOA had set up mobile towers to deter vandalism. When I complained about the glare, they responded with a violation notice. My hedges were too high, allegedly blocking neighborhood sightlines. I trimmed them, only to find 2 HOA inspectors measuring my windows the next day. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Carl, approached me with trembling hands and a confession. "They made me sign a statement," he whispered. "Said if I didn't, I'd be fined for offense code violations. It said you were threatening the peace of the neighborhood." I thanked him and gave him tea. The gloves were off now. Then came the turning point. A knock at my door at 5 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday. I opened it to find fire trucks outside, red lights painting the walls in flashes. A firefighter looked at me, puzzled. "Report of a gas leak," he said, "originating from your crawl space." Gas? I'd had my system upgraded just last year. They inspected. No leak. But something odd caught their attention. Scraped insulation, a loose valve. After they left, I crawled in with a flashlight. What I found made my stomach twist. Someone had intentionally loosened the gas coupling, just enough to eventually leak. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was an attempted arson. They were trying to destroy my home the same way they'd done with the Delaney property 2 streets over. A mysterious electrical fire that conveniently allowed the HOA to condemn the land and sell it to a development firm Darren's cousin conveniently worked for. But I had something they didn't know about yet. While they were busy escalating their attacks, I had been quietly installing a full surveillance grid, night vision, infrared, hidden cameras in birdhouses and garden ornaments. And the night before the gas call, my cameras had recorded everything. At 2:17 a.m., a figure in a hoodie and gloves crawled under my house. At 2:31, they emerged. Their face briefly caught the light, a blurry image but enough for facial recognition. It was Ted Winston, HOA treasurer, Darren's right-hand man. I sent the video to my contact at HUD. Her response came within the hour. "Don't confront them yet. We're ready to move soon. Just keep gathering." That evening, as the rain turned to a storm, I sat in the dark on my front porch, just outside the glow of the HOA floodlights. Karen drove by in her SUV, slowed, and rolled down her window. She smiled, the kind that says, "I own you now." "Looks like your gas lines are as old as your ideas," she said. "Maybe it's time to admit this house isn't safe anymore. Join us. We could protect you." I stood, slowly, calm as still water. "You should be more careful with threats," I said. "They tend to leave evidence." She chuckled and drove off. But I wasn't rattled. I was ready. That night, I contacted a local journalist I'd once helped on a zoning case. I sent her a complete dossier: videos, documentation, witness statements. I didn't ask her to run it yet, just to hold it, for insurance. Because I knew what was coming next: the demolition order. I woke up Friday morning to the sound of diesel engines outside my window. 3 city trucks, a small bulldozer, HOA board members standing in my driveway, clipboards in hand. Darren was among them, dressed like a general leading a campaign. They had a paper: "Immediate Neighborhood Code Enforcement," signed by a municipal inspector I'd never heard of, dated just 1 day earlier, claiming my property was structurally compromised and a hazard to the public. They were really doing it. But they didn't know my cameras had captured Ted tampering, or that my HUD contact had already sent a cease and desist letter to the city office, or that federal agents were watching, waiting for one final, undeniable act of malicious intent. As the bulldozer revved, Darren approached. "This is your last chance," he said, not even pretending anymore. "You can sell to us, quietly, or we remove the structure as a public danger." I stared him down, then smiled. "Proceed." He blinked. "You sure?" "Positive. Because the moment they crossed the line, the hammer would fall. And I wanted every single one of them under it." The bulldozer's engine roared louder, drowning out the murmurs of the gathering neighbors. Darren raised a gloved hand like a conductor about to cue an orchestra, and then everything stopped. A black SUV with government plates rolled to a halt at the curb. Out stepped Monica Reyes, special agent with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Behind her, 2 FBI agents emerged, followed by a county legal observer. They moved with purpose, unbothered by the pouring rain or the stunned expressions of the HOA board. "Mr. Carter," Monica nodded to me. "Agent Reyes," I returned coolly. Darren looked confused. "Excuse me, this is private." "No, Mr. Bellamy," Monica cut him off sharply. "This is now a federal matter." The color drained from his face. Karen, who had just stepped out of her SUV with an umbrella and a clipboard, froze mid-stride. "This demolition is halted effective immediately under federal injunction," Monica continued. "We have substantial evidence of coordinated harassment, property tampering, and attempted arson related to this HOA." I took a step forward, lifting a hand to the crowd now gathering beyond the lawn. "For the record," I said, my voice rising just above the rain, "I gave them every chance to walk away." Karen regained her voice first. You can't be serious. You think a couple of pictures. Actually, Agent Reyes said, lifting a small tablet. We have video footage, eyewitness testimony, financial records, and a 5-year pattern of property acquisition through intimidation. You and your board have systematically targeted homeowners, sabotaged private residences, and falsified code violations to force sales. Darren lunged forward, voice cracking. We were protecting the neighborhood. These were decrepit properties. We were doing the city a favor. One of the FBI agents stepped between him and Agent Reyes. Step back, Mr. Bellamy. Karen was shaking now, her voice shrill and cracking under the pressure. This is a setup. That house was dangerous. It's not even up to code. Actually, I said, unfolding a laminated document from my coat pocket. It's been on the historic registry since 1976, certified, inspected, and protected. Your violation letters, legally meaningless, and every one of them has been documented. At that, Monica handed over a cease and desist order directly to Karen. You are not to set foot on this property again. If you or any HOA board member attempts contact, you will be arrested for harassment and trespassing. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft thud of rain on umbrellas and jackets. And then it happened. Ted Winston, the HOA treasurer, the same man who'd crept under my house weeks ago, panicked. He tried to run. Before he reached the sidewalk, 2 agents tackled him to the ground. In his pocket, a burner phone, the same one used to place anonymous tips to the fire department, code enforcement, and the city's neighborhood improvement line. It was over. Karen didn't speak. She simply dropped her clipboard and stared blankly at the sidewalk, realizing in real time that she had lost everything. By nightfall, the entire HOA board had been suspended from operations. The county launched an official investigation into all their past enforcement actions. The city began reviewing every permit issued under their recommendations. Neighbors, once cowed into silence, stepped forward. Carl, the retired teacher who'd first warned me, gave a sworn statement about the coercion. So did Mrs. Watson, the widow whose garden had been ripped out. Even former HOA members admitted to being strong-armed into silence. The news broke that weekend. HOA under federal investigation for fraud, harassment, and arson attempt. Karen's smiling face, once plastered over every community bulletin, was now featured on the local 6 o'clock news, with a very different headline. And me? I stayed silent. I didn't gloat, I didn't rub it in. I rebuilt my fence, repainted my trim. But I made one quiet change, an elegant brass plaque placed near my mailbox. It read, "This property survived corruption, intimidation, and fire. Because sometimes, the law needs to bloom like a rose. I still hear the wind chimes at night, still sit on the swing where this all began. But the air feels different now, free. 3 months had passed since the federal raid. Karen Thompson was now awaiting trial on 18 federal charges, including conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, property tampering, and attempted arson. Her once impeccable McMansion had been seized under the RICO Act, its windows dark, its garden overgrown, a shell of the dominance she once wielded. Darren Bellamy had taken a plea deal. The moment he realized no HOA insurance policy would cover the intentional crimes they orchestrated, he turned over emails, meeting recordings, even spreadsheets showing projected profits from redevelopment acquisitions. The HOA was formally dissolved. A county-appointed receiver took control of all their assets. Those funds, once weaponized against neighbors, were redistributed as reparations. Each family that had been bullied, extorted, or harassed received compensation. And me? I stood on my restored front porch, the morning sun glinting off freshly polished Victorian purple trim, the same color my grandmother once mixed by hand. The wind chimes danced in the early breeze, their soft notes carrying peace instead of dread. The house had been rebuilt, brick by brick, thanks to a combination of legal damages, community donations, and my own savings. But I didn't stop at just rebuilding. I transformed it. What once was a home was now the Bloom House Community Center. Part museum, part legal aid office, and part neighborhood gathering space. It became a living monument to resisting abuse, to standing your ground with integrity. Inside, there was a room dedicated to the story. Framed photos of the house before the fire. A wall of HOA letters, each one redacted, pinned like fallen leaves. And at the center, in a glass case, sat Karen's broken coffee mug and my charred wind chimes. Symbols of arrogance and resilience side by side. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose garden was once destroyed, was now leading a volunteer gardening club. Kids came on Saturdays to plant flowers in our shared community plot, many of which bloomed in the same soil Karen tried to salt with fear. Carl, the retired teacher, led history tours of the neighborhood, educating visitors on preservation, property rights, and what can happen when small tyrants go unchecked. We created something bigger than any HOA rulebook, a real community, not built on conformity, but connection. One afternoon, a young couple stopped outside the house. They'd just moved in from out of state. "Is this the one that survived the fire?" the woman asked, brushing her hand across the trim. I nodded. "And everything that came before it," she smiled. "We heard the story. It's what made us move here. Felt like a place where people still stand for something." Months later, I stood again in court, not as a victim or a judge, but as a witness. The courtroom was smaller this time, less media, more heart. Karen sat behind the defense table, a shadow of the force she once was. Gone were the expensive suits and the smug smile. In their place, a trembling woman staring down the reality she built. The prosecutor turned to me. "Judge DeWitt, can you tell us what this ordeal meant to you?" I looked directly at Karen, not with hatred, but with calm resolve. It reminded me why the law must be grounded in compassion, not control. Why power, unchecked, rots from within. But more importantly, it proved that no matter how loud intimidation gets, truth, community, and legacy are louder, even if they have to whisper for a while first. When the sentence came, 22 years federal prison, Karen didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked at the courtroom, at me, and blinked like someone waking from a long, cruel dream. Every morning now, I drink my coffee from a ceramic mug painted purple, a gift from the local kids. The back reads, "To the woman who turned fire into flowers." I sit on my swing, listening to the wind chimes, watching neighbors wave, share pies, swap stories. There's laughter where once there were whispers, community where there once was control. And sometimes when the breeze is just right, I hear Grandma's voice in those chimes. "Some roots run too deep to burn." She was right. The house stands, the legacy blooms, and justice echoes forever.